This story dates all the way back to 1969, when I was just a kid. It was Father's Day weekend. My father wanted to go hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee with the family. I wasn't that big of a fan of hiking, but I respected my father and what he wanted to do on his holiday. We were about 30 minutes into the hike when we heard a sickening scream coming from the forest. It didn't sound like it was very close, but we all clearly heard it. My father told us to keep our voices down and to be alert. I was a bit scared, but I felt safe around my family. 5 minutes later, a figure came out from the trees in front of us and onto the trail. It was a rough-looking vagrant who was carrying clothing over his shoulder. He simply looked at us, crossed the trail, and disappeared back into the forest. My father thought this was very unusual, but we moved on from it. I was still a young child back then, and wasn't fully aware of the implications of what we saw. This was a time long before cell phones, but even today, that particular area has little to no signal. We stopped hiking 2 hours later and returned to our car. It was a good thing that we called it quits when we did, because it began downpouring as soon as we got back. Before we took off, my parents discussed about reporting what we saw earlier to the police, and it was decided that we would stop by the police station on our way back home. We got to the station and filed a report. Before we left, a police officer told us something even more concerning. There was a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin that was reported missing earlier that day. He had been camping with his family a short distance away from where we were. The boy's father said the last time he saw him, he was going behind a bush while playing hide and seek with some other campers. When they finished playing, all the children returned to the campsite. Dennis was nowhere to be seen. 5 minutes had passed, and the father started to get very concerned about where his son was and began searching the forest for him, desperately calling out his name. After several hours of searching with no clues, they sought help from the park rangers. The location of where Dennis had disappeared was only 5 miles from where we were hiking at the time, which makes me wonder if that scream we heard was connected to this event. After filing the report, we went back home. Over the next several days, we would get constant phone calls from the police department asking for more details about the man we saw. At that point, it had been raining for days, which complicated the search efforts. There was still no trace of Dennis anywhere. Up to 1,400 people were involved in the search, which included park rangers, military, police, and the Boy Scouts. Child-sized footprints were discovered, leading to a nearby stream. Park rangers came up with a theory that Dennis had gotten lost and was swept away by the stream. The search would go on for 2 more weeks, until the end of June. The rescue was officially closed in September of 1969. There were 3 main theories about what could have happened to Dennis Martin. The first theory is that he got lost and perished from exposure not long after the first night. The second theory was that he was attacked by a bear and was carried off. The third and most probable theory is that he was abducted and taken out of the park or was murdered. As of today, the disappearance of Dennis Martin remains an unsolved mystery. I know what I saw with my own 2 eyes on that gloomy day in June. There was a man walking through the trees, carrying what could have been children's clothing over his shoulder. We did the right thing and reported it to the authorities. I felt heartbroken for the kid and his family. I can't imagine what they have gone through all these years of not knowing what happened to Dennis. I'll preface this by saying that I'm 35 years old now, but I was 16 when this happened. It was 2006 in Knoxville, Tennessee. We had a new English teacher. Her name was Erin McLean. She didn't seem too odd at first, but as my junior year went on, she started showing up in short skirts and revealing tops, and became very flirtatious with the guys in my class. One of them was a senior named Sean Powell, whom she was especially flirty with. I'll be honest, being a hormone-driven teenager and having a 20-something-year-old teacher hit on me was very arousing at the time. But I wasn't quite aware of the implications of all this, or the potential danger it could cause. Sometime in late 2006, Sean dropped out after his grades plummeted. Since he was 18, he was a legal adult. Mrs. McLean was still pretty flirtatious with the rest of us, so we carried on like nothing happened. What did occur behind closed doors, however, is something unsettling to think about, even today. Sean moved into a small shed-like building where Mrs. McLean's husband, Eric McLean, practiced with his band. Her husband, being the nice guy he was, allowed him to stay. But after some time, Erin and Sean developed a sexual relationship. A few months after this, Eric found out about the affair and confronted his wife about it, who insisted on staying with Sean. Her husband was completely devastated, but tried his best to stay strong for his kids. However, this situation finally concluded in the worst way. On March 10th of 2007, Sean showed up at the McLean's home, where Eric answered the door. Sean became very angry and belligerent and started a verbal argument with Eric. Sean ran to his car, but didn't drive away. He just sat there. According to some reports, he was drunk at the time. Eric went out to confront him with a shotgun in his hand. According to Eric, he pointed the gun at Sean only as a threat to get him to leave. Sean then laughed at him, grabbing the gun, and it went off right in his face. Erin made the call to the police, and Eric was arrested. Eric was eventually sentenced to 90 days after being found guilty of reckless homicide, which is a much lesser charge than murder. Erin McLean never appeared at her husband's trial, which tells you everything you need to know about her character. She was taken away in handcuffs during a custody hearing and was sentenced to 90 days in jail after taking her sons out of state without permission. When I found out about this whole thing, I was really shaken to my core. I felt bad for both Eric and Sean. They were both manipulated by a conniving woman. I am married to myself now, and when I have kids, I'll share this story to teach them that toying with someone's emotions can be like playing with fire.
Growing up, I spent every summer at my grandparents' house in rural Tennessee. When I say rural, I mean their town was literally a cluster of homes with a singular one-lane road as the only way in and out. It was 45 minutes from the nearest freeway on-ramp, 30 minutes from the nearest grocery store, and an hour and a half to a Sam's Club or Costco. My grandparents still live there to this day and make that drive monthly. Yeah, fuck that. What I'm trying to say here is this is about as remote as it gets. I would play outside for hours on end and only see 2 or 3 cars pass by. It was around 11:30 p.m. and my dad and I couldn't sleep because it was an especially hot and muggy night. We decided to go for a drive on the curvy back roads that ran through the hills that I absolutely loved and still do to this day. There was a scenic access site that was just a clearing overlooking a cliff about 15 minutes from my grandparents' house. It wasn't very well known. It was down a narrow 2-track road with a couple of dilapidated trailers lining it every quarter mile or so. Due to the isolation and lack of any real police presence, the area was infested with meth heads during this time, and there was a local rumor that an inbred cult resided somewhere in the forest. Keep in mind, it was around midnight by the time we got to what you can loosely call a parking lot for the overlook. My dad has always had a bit of an intuition, and he asked me if I really wanted to get out of the car. That made me hesitant myself, but I saw the amount of lightning bugs that were out, and catching them was one of my favorite pastimes. Armed with a flashlight and a container with some holes drilled in it, we set off down the path to the cliff. We immediately heard sounds coming from the woods, then heavy footsteps. Way too heavy to be a deer, and there wasn't really a bear problem in this area. The woods were unusually quiet besides that. Then, we both thought we saw someone hiding behind a tree out of the corner of our eyes. Here's where the situation gets a bit freaky. Once we made it down the path to the cliff, we saw a figure of a man. He was about my dad's height, 5'10", but he was as thin as a rail. He couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds. He wasn't there to admire the moonlight scenery. He was standing perpendicular to it, just staring off into the trees, perfectly still. My dad slightly nudged me in the direction of our car. As I started walking back, my dad had shined his light on the man. As soon as the light hit him, my dad gasped and then dropped the flashlight before literally picking me up and sprinting full force back to our car. And as we peeled out of there, I had no idea what the fuck was going on. That man's face, it looked like a melted candle. My dad said after a few minutes of silence after we had pulled out onto the main road. Apparently the man he saw had no nose, just 2 nostril holes in his face. The way he was described sounded like he might have been a burn victim. As we brought it up to my grandmother the next day at breakfast, she immediately turned pale. Apparently there was a meth lab explosion up in the hills a few months prior. Since then, they had to resort to making their product in the forest and are very defensive, even homicidal about those who wander into their operation.
I used to live in a part of Memphis that was a bit shady, right on the edge of what some would call the ghetto. But there was also a nearby area that was pretty secluded, as I lived on the outskirts of the city, near the industrial area known as Raleigh, for those who are familiar. I was 8 years old when this happened, and my sister is 5 years my senior. The two of us would go for walks on occasion out of boredom. On this particular time, we went to the very back of the housing development, and further than we had ever gone before. This area was desolate, just train tracks and a nearby manufacturing facility. Lots of dry grass coming through the spots in the gravel, lots of dusty junk people dumped back here illegally, and there used to be a pack of stray dogs that wandered around my neighborhood. But other than that, no people or cars would really ever be seen out this way. We were just walking along the tracks, talking while throwing rocks, when I saw some strange movement just behind the tree line of a small wooded area about 40 feet ahead of us. I told my sister to look as we made our way closer. We got about 10 or 15 feet away when we realized the movement was in fact a mime of all things. In the middle of nowhere, seemingly hidden among the trees and thick dead vines that adorn the edge of the wooded area. He had a painted face, black striped shirt with black pants. He had the exaggerated expressions of a mime as well. His eyes got really wide when he saw us, and he seemed to start performing. He was kind of doing it in a way, I guess, to attract us. Maybe entice us to enter the wooded area where he stood. But this was about as appealing as giving Art the Clown a ride somewhere. I honestly couldn't tell you much more about this mime, as we ran away quickly. Mimes creep me out when they're on street corners or busy sidewalks, but hiding out in the woods in a very isolated area? No way. I do remember that it was very hot outside that day, and his makeup was dingy and gross, and so was his outfit. I know this sounds pretty unbelievable, but I assure you, this happened. I sometimes wonder who that mime was. I'm sure he wasn't there to kidnap children, but who knows what would have happened if we had gone into that thicket. I think he was just simply insane. The mime's mind was gone, which is far more disturbing than any creepy stranger I've read about. I live in a very rural area in Tennessee, and this happened back in the summer of 92 or 93. I was a preteen back in those days, but I can still see this in my mind like it happened just yesterday. As I said before, it was a very isolated area where we used to have some serious issues with people dumping unwanted, worn-out items and garbage down hillsides and ravines. At the time, it was common to find illegal dumping sites everywhere because there was no bulk pickup offered by our one waste disposal monopoly. In this part of the state, the economic disparity is quite pronounced. You have some of the poorest people, and then you have multiple mansion vacation home folks. My family fell somewhere in the upper middle class. Think about the Titanic. It would have been in the lowest rung of first class, or the very top of second class. Unfortunately, the majority of the town folks would be in steerage or the coal bunker. Well, it was the month of August, also known as sun-scorching heat, and enough humidity to make it slightly uncomfortable to breathe. Many describe it as the swamp-ass capital of the state. We had just had an extraordinarily rare murder in our county. It was all anyone was talking about, and all that you would hear in the churches and beauty salons. The victim was largely unknown, a woman in her early 30s, and was not part of the upper class. I didn't know who she was, nor did anyone else I knew. She had moved here less than a year ago, and kept to herself, and wasn't even reported missing. Then just before our summer break came to an end, this lady was found at the base of a steep incline, deep in one of our densely wooded areas, off a winding dirt road, barely wide enough for one vehicle. If you were to encounter another car on this road, you would have to pull over so far, you would almost be off the road entirely. What was even more creepy, the road was named Bone Road. When she was found, she had lost everything from the neck up. Both her upper and lower areas were recovered. Her killer was unknown. My mother was born and raised here, and was of strong, yet goofy stock. She has always been my best buddy, even when dropping the hammer on my brother and I. She was a teacher, and was loved by every student she ever taught. Our friends adored my goofy mother, even telling me how lucky I was to have her. My dad was a pharmacist in our area, smarter than most, and happy to go fill lost or forgotten prescriptions even late into the night. My dad isn't from around here, but is very well known because of his job. Everyone knew my mother, because her family had been here since our ancestors settled here back in the 1800s. At this time, the rest of her family was living in Middle Tennessee. On that day in August, we had been at a family reunion picnic at the scenic naturally made lake we lived by. Suddenly, a scattered thunderstorm had popped up and brought the get-together to a halt. It was just me and my mom, but on the ride home, we decided that we were Sherlock Holmes and Watson. We wanted to investigate the scene of the crime. I know. Brilliant. My dad was at work at the time, and my brother was visiting a friend. Since this was the early 90s, there was no GPS, Alexa, Siri, or Google Earth, not even MapQuest. My father was on the school board and had been given a highly detailed map of our entire county. Since neither one of us knew how to reach Bone Road, it was agreed that the map would be our guide. We went home, grabbed the map, then set out on our investigation. We eventually located the area, and headed to the spot. Being the ignorant rubberneckers we were, we just planned to drive past this stupid dump site. I can't explain how creepy this place was. It was a murder dump in the middle of nowhere on a road that started with a black top, transitioned to gravel, and then good old dirt. This was mid-afternoon, but the sudden rain made the ground misty. Literal steam was emanating from the road, the fields, the woods, everywhere. That just added to the thrill. As we approached the location, there was a blind curve, making it impossible to see the place from a distance. When we rounded that corner, we saw that we were not alone. A very dirty-looking man and his very dirty-looking truck was pulled over at the dump, just far enough to allow us to pass. Sure, Joe Dirt over here could have been just another onlooker, like us, but he was giving off a very Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibe. Just standing by his truck, looking down into the dump. It wasn't one of our sheriff's deputies. We knew all of our local authorities, and they had cleared this location the day before. As we squeezed past his truck, he was standing by the passenger side door of our car. I obviously wasn't driving at the time, so he was right on my side as we passed. So I could see his 2 teeth clear as day. He smiled in this very creepy, almost leering way. It was more threatening than friendly. We got past and thanked God that Mr. Two-Tooth hadn't followed us. We agreed that we would reach the end of Bone Road, then get the hell out of there. But there was just one problem with this plan. Once you got to the end of Bone Road, it was a dead end. No pun intended. My mom uttered the words that I had been screaming in my head from the moment we saw the man with the truck. Oh, fuck. We had no choice. We had to do a 5-point turn and go back the way we came. Maybe he's gone now. My mom's feeble attempt to soothe both of us. Guess what? He was still there, still smiling his gummy smile. Now, as an adult reflecting back on this, he could have come after us, knowing that we would be cornered, but neither of us has ever been labeled as being rational. We made it out of there unscathed, and of course my dad hit the roof when he heard about our afternoon adventure. But, and you know there's always a but, days later, our newspaper heralded the good news. The murderer had been caught. The woman was killed by her boyfriend turned stalker. She had moved from a town about 45 minutes away to get away from him, but he tracked her down. He just drove around with her body in his truck before dumping it off of Bone Road. As we stared at this guy's mugshot, we realized Mr. Two-Tooth was the killer. Two-Tooth was convicted of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. He will die in the state prison system, serving life with no parole. Still, Mom and I promised that we would never be so dumb again. We still go on sudden adventures from time to time, but never to remote murder dump sites. It is an odd thing, knowing that you were face to face with a killer. I just want to give a big thanks to Southern Cannibal for joining me in today's video. He's a very good friend of mine and an excellent narrator. If you enjoy listening to scary stories, you'll really dig his channel. That's pretty spot on, I think. Are you trying to match my gruff? Because it's not going to happen in this universe.